The mustache is here to distract you from the parts that aren't completely free. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to week 4 of the SCX24 budget build-off, where Matt from the Scale Builders Guild and myself are taking the Axial SCX24 and upgrading it with $50 every week. But not this week. This is free week. This week, we're trying to do some DIY solutions, things you can do without spending money for the most part. We'll get into it though. This week, I'm going to continue focusing on performance. We're going to do what we can with what we have to improve the performance of this truck even further. Last week was week 3, and in week 3 we kind of went through and explained center of gravity a little bit further, which we're going to touch on again this week as well. But we also replaced the front gear cover with a brass unit. We also extended the wheelbase by using longer front links. And then we replaced the front bumper with a 3D printed unit. Now, one thing I want to touch on before we move on to this week is the front links. I purchased the link set that I showed in last week's video to do this installation. However, the links that I used are actually included in the box of pretty much all of your SCX24s. No matter which one you have, you should be able to do what I showed here for zero cost. Now, I'm not going to go back and adjust the budget, because if you're like me and maybe you misplaced those parts, then that's what you would have done. Thought I would make note of that just in case you're thinking about doing a similar modification. Now this week, again, we are going to focus on center of gravity, because that's one of the easiest things to work on for free. Basically, what we need to try and do is lower the weight of the vehicle. Now, we've added things like brass components in previous weeks, but that's not going to be free. We're gonna have to pay for those items to put on there. There's things you could do like wrapping weight around the wheels, but I've also talked about rotational mass and how I'd like to keep that to a minimum for the most part. So I don't wanna do that either. Instead, what I wanna do is I wanna take some time and move around some of the items that are already installed on the vehicle. And the two obvious items to do that are the two items that sit on the very top of this chassis. One is the combination ESC receiver combo, and the other is the battery. So we're gonna spend some time trying to relocate those to get them as low and as light as possible. The first one that I want to talk about is the battery. Now, the battery that comes with the SCX24 is this little Reaction 2S 350 milliamp pack. It's a very flat but wide LiPo pack. I've never included the cost of batteries in the actual budget build, but none of those vehicles have ever come with a battery either. So you've always had to buy something no matter what. This time, since it comes with one, trying to change batteries is something that maybe gets a little bit more sticky. But I did want to discuss an option at the very least. I picked up these packs from Gens Ace. It's under their tattoo line, and this is a 300 milliamp pack. The length overall is 4 or 5 millimeters shorter. It's about half the width of the widest part. So it is thicker by almost double, but in general, I like the form factor of this battery a little bit better. And for what I really want to get done this week, I think it would be one of the better choices for it. But we're going to look at both the stock battery and this aftermarket battery. If you're an SCX24 owner and you'd like to drive often, then picking up some batteries isn't a bad idea. These are really inexpensive, probably worth looking at if I was to suggest other batteries to you. Now, you have a lot of options when it comes to relocating components like this. You have the option of taking the battery and trying to move it up front, and the theory behind that would be trying to take the weight of the battery and move it more forward for more forward bias. But it's gonna keep it up high. And for me, on an SCX24, I would rather have my weight lower rather than forward. Forward is great, but low is the most important to me. So having it a little bit more mid-mounted but lower is the route that I think is going to be the best for my driving style at the very least. To accomplish that, we're going to look at two methods. The first one is that we're going to take this stock battery tray and modify it to flip it over and lower it down. That way we can get the battery further down between the frame rails, trying to make as much difference as possible with the center of mass of this battery. For a flat battery pack like this, with its pretty consistent rectangular shape, negating the wires, the center of mass would be in the middle lengthwise, in the middle width, and in the middle height-wise. So getting that center point as low as possible is what we're looking for. I'm gonna do some rough estimated numbers to compare where we're at now to where we're going to end up. Let's install this battery in there, measure where the center of mass roughly is for this pack when it's installed, and then modify our battery tray and take another measurement. I'm gonna estimate about 64 millimeters from the table surface to my estimated center of mass of that battery pack. Now, my method for this is going to be to take the factory battery tray, and we're actually going to flip it over and then put this into the frame rail after doing some modifications. Now, I get to Rachel Ray you a little bit, as I've got a second one here that I already completed these modifications to. Now you can see it's been trimmed down quite a bit. We're going to completely remove these taller standoffs. We do have to do a little bit of trimming on the back side of the tray. The flat portion of the battery tray past the shorter standoffs that kind of bumps outwards, those need to be trimmed off. On the front portion, we are going to have to do a notch around the factory motor to get this thing to sit down as far as possible. We will also have to trim off the tabs that previously held the battery in place. Now, we aren't going to be able to use the factory mounting holes, as those are a little bit too high now, and it will push the whole tray down into the upper links. So what we needed to do was drill a couple of very small holes about midway down that standoff. I used a very tiny drill bit. You want to use a drill bit that measures somewhere around 1.4 millimeters or smaller. This one I used in a very small hand drill. Now, this is a kind of specialty tool that you may not have laying around. I believe that this came out of a Gundam modeling kit when I was doing some styrene work. I'll try and find a similar kit and link it in the description below. I know that that doesn't make it free, but I never feel too bad about suggesting tools. You can never have enough tools, and if you don't have this, you definitely need it. So once you have that done, just kind of put it into the chassis, screw it in, see if anything's interfering. Because our cuts may not be exactly the same, you may have to do a little bit of trimming or sanding here or there. I'm going to replace the Velcro strap now onto this battery tray, and we're going to bolt this back into the chassis. Now, with the stock battery in the new battery tray location, it does get the battery much lower, although it doesn't lay perfectly flat just because of the width of the pack and the actual width of the chassis, but it's definitely an improvement. If I measure the new estimated center of mass of the battery, it looks like we're closer to somewhere between 59 and 60 millimeters. So 4 or 5 millimeters for that weight is a pretty big difference. But I also have another option for you, and that is this 3D printed battery tray that I designed up. Rather than modifying the stock tray, you could easily just drop this in instead if you have access to a 3D printer. I know not everybody does, so I didn't want to solely rely on the use of a 3D printer to achieve exactly what we're after, but I am going to install this one into my vehicle, as I think that it'll give me a little bit more improvement in center of gravity. Using the 300 milliamp battery, I was able to decrease it now to somewhere between 53 and 54 millimeters. It's around a 10 millimeter difference between where we started and where we are now. A huge improvement, I would consider, at this scale. One thing to note about these small 300 milliamp GenZace packs is that they do have a very short battery lead, so you'll either need to find a small extension or make longer battery leads yourself. Now, the next item that I want to look at is this combination ESC receiver. Now, for this modification, I want to push your comfort level quite a bit. Now, one thing that I will say is that the quality of this combination ESC receiver is questionable. The low speed control is not great. The stock radio is just okay. Now, I get not wanting to have to put all new electronics in with the receiver, a new radio of some sort, and a new ESC. Down the road though, trying to push the performance of this truck, that's the route that I do want to go eventually. So diving in and tackling the modifications that I'm about to explain are a little bit less scary. What we're talking about doing is doing some soldering on this combination ESC receiver. I want to remove the unit from where it's at currently, and then I want to decase it, meaning remove the plastic shrouding that covers the PCB inside of it. And then I want to go a little bit further by eliminating some things on the board that maybe aren't needed so that we can shave weight, make it smaller, and so that we can get it into a position that's as far forward and as low as possible. Before we remove it from the chassis, let's get an estimated center of mass on it. I'm going to kind of measure towards the bottom side of the entire unit just to be a little bit more conservative. Again, we're around 63 millimeters to the bottom of the case. After removing it from the chassis, we need to remove the stickers off of the sides of the case. Then we're going to take and push in the little tabs so that we can separate the case halves. Now, the only part that we're interested in is this circuit board. Now, what I was talking about for removing unnecessary items is things like this power switch. I don't really use power switches. They're not needed. I usually just plug my battery in when I'm using it, unplug it when I'm done. And we don't actually have to desolder this power switch. It is soldered to the board, but we can actually remove it by just cutting some of these little tabs. After removing that power switch, we do need to complete that circuit. So the on side of the switch is the two outside pins. So if you can kind of just pinch those together, and then we're going to add some solder to them to permanently connect them to each other. I'm going to use a super fine tip on my soldering iron. With the tip of my soldering iron tinned, or putting a little bit of solder on it so it transfers heat better, I'm going to add a little bit of solder to those two pins. Next, we have the battery and the motor connectors. Now, if you like, you could actually just grab the plastic portion of these and pull them straight up off the board. It may take a little bit of wiggling back and forth, but you can get them to pop off. And then you're left with two exposed pins again. Now, here is where your level of comfort may vary. One option is to take this board and put it in your helping hands of some sort, and then we can heat the back side of these very tiny pins and we can remove them from the board. Now, by doing that, we'll have the pins to reinsert into our factory connectors that we pulled off of the board. From there, we can solder those pins to some small lengths of wire, giving ourselves a pigtail to come off of our ESC and receiver combo. I'm going to begin to heat up the pin from the back side, and I'm going to grab the pin with my flush cuts. After applying some heat, I can pull that pin out. You don't want to overheat the board as you can damage it. Again, this is a good opportunity to practice if especially you're looking to upgrade the ESC in the future. Take the opportunity and play with some of these electronics. Do something wild that you wouldn't normally do. It's worth it to learn something that you've never tried before. After you've removed pins, make sure that there's nothing bridging or touching the two solder pads to create a short on the board. After that, you can solder wires directly onto those solder pads. Just drop a little bit of solder on there with your soldering iron to give you a spot to get those wires attached to. Tin the ends of some new wires and attach them in those locations. Now, I did this on the battery one specifically so that I can run those 300 milliamp packs that have the very short connector. The motor, however, I'm not going to put that plug on the end of wires. I'm simply going to solder my motor wires directly onto the board at that location. So that's going to be my next step. After cutting off the stock plug, I trimmed back a little bit of the wire, and now I'm going to tin those wires. Tin the wire first, and then I'm going to shorten them. I only want a couple millimeters of exposed wire so that there isn't any chance of them moving around and shorting out against themselves or anything else nearby. If you're going this method, you don't need to desolder the pins. You can actually just cut them nearly flush, and that will suffice. And one other last thing that I did is this little drag brake link that goes in there. And all it's doing is bridging two pins. Now, I didn't solder those two pins together, but I just took this thing and I just cut this extra tab off just so that it's a smaller and more compact piece that fits into tighter spaces. So now we've done the hard part. We've decased and modified our ESC receiver combo. Now we have to get it back into the vehicle. Now we could put it exactly where it was and it would be lighter weight because it doesn't have a big plastic case that isn't needed anymore, which does have a little bit of mass to it. rather than paying to add extra weight, you can get rid of weight for free. But what I want to do instead is I want to try and mount it underneath of the tray that it was previously attached to. Now to do that, I believe that I'm going to have to remove one of the mounting feet. It's connected at the shock towers and then 2 other locations. I'm going to just trim off one of the other 2 locations, and then I'm going to double-sided tape this unit to the underside of that tray.
This building is so confusing.
All right, with everything relocated to the bottom side of that tray, I took another measurement, and it looks like my center of mass of that is roughly around 54 to 55 millimeters now. So again, just a nice drop down in that mass. With the SCX24, the size of that, these measurements are considerable. They're not something to just kind of brush off as, unnecessary. It's going to be something that is going to help this truck be even more planted. Since this was free week, we didn't technically spend any money. I did use some wire and some tools that weren't necessarily standard, and I showed you a battery that I'm using that didn't come with the truck, but the stock battery still works. It's one that we'd still run if we're trying to get multiple packs worth of runtime. Then why not have more than one battery? Again, I'll link to that battery that I was using and the tools that I talked about. But beyond that, that's really all for free week. Now, I had a second plan for free week that I didn't go into, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't. But I do want to talk about it because I still think that I'm going to incorporate it into the series. Would you guys be interested in installing an all-new chassis on the vehicle if I provided you with all of the information you needed to make it yourself? Not just 3D print it, but actually make rigid chassis rails yourself. Question for next week. I'm interested to hear what your guys' response to that would be. It doesn't have to be that difficult to make your own chassis rails. The project that I am discussing would require 3D printing cross braces and things like that. But being a regular week, we could include the cost of actual printed items in the budget if that's something you guys would rather see. So leave me your comments below. Definitely like to read them, hear how you guys would like me to approach the possibility of installing an aftermarket or custom DIY chassis into our truck here. With that though, make sure you go check out Matt's video for week 4, see what he got done for spending almost no money as well. Halfway through the budget build at this point already. Time flies, a lot left to do though. This truck is a long way from stock with performance and style. Make sure you come back next week for week 5 of the SCX24 budget build off. Looking forward to it and diving even further into this build. Thanks again for watching. If you like these videos, hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already, and hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. As always, thanks again for watching. We'll see you on the next one.